My sister stood in court holding my husband's hand like she'd earned the right to stand beside him. The room fell quiet just before she said it. Pay up or step aside. Her voice didn't shake. Mine didn't either, though my parents shifted closer to her side of the aisle, already choosing their version of the truth. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to accept the humiliation they decided I deserved. Instead, I looked at all of them, and I smiled. They had no idea what was coming next. People like to assume I was always the quiet one, the steady daughter, the reliable sister, the woman who never raised her voice unless absolutely necessary. And maybe that used to be true. I built my life on predictability, on routines that made sense. Morning coffee at the same corner shop, reports reviewed before sunrise. My evening spent unwinding with a book instead of a screen. In operations management, order isn't just helpful, it's survival. And order was something I understood deeply, but families have a way of rewriting who you are, even when you're standing right there listening. Growing up, Haley was the girl who could cry her way out of anything. If she dropped a glass, she cried. If she got caught lying, she cried harder. Mom would gather her into her arms like she was made of spun sugar. Dad would sigh at me and ask, "Can't you be a little gentler with your sister?" I'd be the one sweeping the glass, fixing the mess, stepping aside so she could shine. That became our pattern. I cleaned up quietly. She sparkled loudly. Marcus entered my life years later, drawn to the calm I carried like a second skin. He once told me, "You make everything feel grounded." For a long time, I believed that meant something sacred. Maybe it did until the day my steadiness became something he used against me, evidence that I didn't feel enough, that I was distant, that Haley was simply more expressive. Funny how words can be softened into excuses when someone needs them to be. The shift was subtle at first. Whispered conversations between them in the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. A shared laugh that lingered a little too long. Haley showing up at our place just to talk but staying past midnight. Marcus defending her at every turn. I'd find her perfume in our guest bathroom and convince myself she just sprayed too much. I'd open the laundry and see a shirt I didn't recognize, and Marcus would shrug like it wasn't worth discussing. Then came the family dinners, the ones where Mom watched Haley with a warmth she'd never once aimed at me. And Dad asked Marcus if he was managing okay with all the stress Riley puts on herself. I sat there, fork paused midair, realizing the story was shifting and I hadn't been invited into the author's room. When Haley announced her pregnancy, she cried. Of course she cried, and Mom hugged her so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. Marcus stood behind her with a hand on her shoulder. No one looked at me, not even once. And in that strange suspended moment, I understood the betrayal didn't start with the affair. It started long before, with every moment my family chose convenience over truth. I wasn't angry yet, I was simply waking up. The weeks after Haley's pregnancy announcement felt like walking through a house where every picture frame had been tilted overnight. Nothing looked wrong at first glance, but every detail was off. Mom called me more often, not to check on me, but to report how fragile Haley was feeling. Dad suggested I lighten up on the work stress, as if the tension knotting my shoulders had anything to do with spreadsheets. And Marcus, he played his role with almost elegant restraint. He never said I was unstable. He simply implied it in the soft, careful tone people use when they're building a case. "She's been overwhelmed lately," he told my parents over dinner, knowing I was within earshot. "It's been a tough season," he added with a sigh, like the weight of my existence rested entirely on his broad, compassionate shoulders. Haley nodded beside him, eyes lowered just enough to look concerned, but not enough to hide her satisfaction. She'd perfected that performance years ago. Then the story started shifting. She cried at work, Haley told Mom. She snapped at a barista. She forgot an appointment. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Not when my family already had a narrative they preferred. One night, Mom called with a voice full of urgency. "We're worried about you, sweetheart. Marcus is doing his best, but you need support." It was the first time I realized they'd switched my role in the family script. I wasn't the steady one anymore. I was the problem to be handled. The real turning point came in a plain white envelope slipped under my apartment door. A notice to appear in court, a child support hearing. I read it twice, then a third time, convinced I'd misunderstood. But the wording was clear. Haley and Marcus were petitioning for financial support, claiming I was the most stable member of the family, and therefore best positioned to contribute to the child's well-being. The child they conceived behind my back. I brought the letter to my parents' house, hoping despite everything to hear disbelief, outrage, a hint of loyalty. Instead, they stood together in the living room, expressions resolute. "Riley, Dad said you're financially secure, you can help." Mom folded her arms. "It's not the baby's fault. Don't punish an innocent child." And when I asked if they understood what they were supporting, what Haley and Marcus had done, Haley stepped forward, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, the other reaching back for Marcus. "We're building a family," she whispered. "You can either help or step aside." There it was, the first version of the line she'd later repeat in court. A threat disguised as reason, a command wrapped in honey. And in that moment, something inside me finally sharpened. Anger wasn't hitting me like a wave. It was rising steady and controlled like water finding its level. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly, feeling everything inside me rearrange. The story they were writing was almost complete. They had no idea I was about to take the pen back. The night after my parents chose their side, I went home to an apartment that suddenly felt borrowed. Nothing had changed physically. Same eucalyptus candle on the counter, same stack of reports waiting on my desk, but the air felt thinner, like the walls were listening. I set my keys down and finally let myself sit on the floor, knees pulled tight to my chest. The silence pressed against me cold and steady. It wasn't grief. Not yet. It was the weight of understanding. They weren't confused. They weren't misled. They chose the easier story, the one where Haley was soft and helpless, and I was rigid enough to carry everyone else's mistakes. I stayed there a long time, staring at the pattern of light crawling across the floor from the street lamp outside. Eventually, my breathing evened out. The collapse was quiet, contained exactly the way my family always expected strength to look on me. But something shifted beneath it, something sharp. When I finally stood, it wasn't to cry. It was to work. I pulled out my planner, my phone, my laptop. I started sifting through everything, text schedules, VoIP logs, photos. I combed through months of conversations, not looking for pain, but for patterns. And the patterns were there, blunt, sloppy, arrogant. Messages from Marcus to Haley. At hours he claimed he'd been training. Haley telling Mom she'd brought me dinner the night I was actually out of town for work. My parents praising Marcus for supporting the family, while Haley, in a separate thread, bragged to a friend about how she was finally getting the life she deserved. The narrative wasn't just flawed, it was engineered. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock from next door. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Turner, stood in her slippers holding a small glass dish. "I made too much soup," she said. She always said that. We talked a little weather traffic, nothing heavy until she hesitated. "I saw Marcus at your sister's place a lot this past spring," she murmured. Before all this mess. I thought you knew." Her words weren't sharp, but they pierced anyway. Even the outside world had seen the truth long before my own family admitted it. I thanked her, closed the door gently, and sat back down with my notes. By 2 a.m, the beginnings of a blueprint spread across my kitchen table. A timeline, a set of contradictions, a string of messages and behaviors that alone meant little, but together painted the clearest picture I'd ever seen. Haley and Marcus weren't just selfish, they were strategic. And for the first time, I realized I could be strategic too. When dawn broke, I packed everything into a folder. Dates, screenshots, observations, statements, each page a piece of a story they never expected me to tell. Later in court, they would see that folder and mistake it for hesitation. But in the moment when I closed it, when my fingers brushed the edge of the paper and a calm settled into my bones, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. I looked at the folder and exhaled slowly. I just smiled, because now the story belonged to me. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place meant to intimidate by reminding you how many lives had been rearranged within its walls. I walked in a lone folder tucked beneath my arm, the one I'd spent weeks assembling. My heels echoed down the hallway like a metronome marking the final countdown. Haley and Marcus were already inside, seated together at the petitioner's table. She was holding his hand, her thumb, brushing over his knuckles in small, triumphant strokes. When she looked up and saw me, her smile tightened. Not nervous, not guilty, just smug, the way someone smiles when they think the finish line is already behind them. My parents sat behind them, leaning forward as if to physically hold up their narrative. Mom gave me a curt nod. Dad didn't look at me at all. The judge entered and the room snapped into a hush. We rose. We sat. And the hearing began. Haley's attorney spoke first. She had a voice like polished marble, smooth, hard, unwavering. Your Honor, this case is simple. The child was born into a complex family situation. Ms. Riley is the only one with stable income and long-term financial consistency. She has been part of the support system, and we request formal contribution to ensure the baby's well-being. My breath didn't stutter, but my fingers tightened slightly on the folder. Haley didn't look at the judge when the lawyer spoke. She looked at me, as if expecting me to crumble on cue. Marcus cleared his throat dramatically. Riley knows we're just trying to do what's best. She knows. She's always been the responsible one. Responsible. Not betrayed. Not wronged. Just responsible. It was almost funny. Then Haley stood. She laced her fingers with Marcus's and faced the judge with a trembling lower lip. We're not asking for much. Just help. My sister understands family responsibility, or at least she used to. Behind her, Mom murmured an approving, "That's right." The judge turned to me. "Ms. Riley, do you have a response?" This was the moment Haley had been waiting for, the moment she expected me to break fold or apologize for things I never did. She expected the quiet sister, the accommodating one, the girl who cleaned up broken glass while she got comforted. Instead, I reached for my folder and stood. Before I opened it, I looked directly at Haley. I just smiled. Her expression faltered almost imperceptibly. Then I flipped open the folder. "Your Honor," I began. "I do have a response, and I'd like to start by clearing up a few details." I laid the first page on the table. A printed text thread, dates, times, locations. This, I said, is Marcus messaging Haley during hours he claimed to be at work. Dozens of times. Over several months. The judge adjusted their glasses. Haley's face drained of color. I continued. "These I added, placing the next sheet down, are screenshots of Haley telling my mother that I broke down crying at work on a day I was traveling for a conference in Seattle. Here I pointed is the time-stamped itinerary." My parents looked at each other. Confusion, doubt, a flicker of something that wasn't certainty anymore. Haley whispered, "That's taken out of context." I didn't look at her. I wasn't finished. "This," I said, sliding another page forward, "is a statement from Mrs. Turner, my neighbor, confirming she saw Marcus visiting Haley regularly long before my marriage ended. And here I laid down another sheet, is Marcus texting Haley after one of those visits saying, 'It's better if Riley thinks we're helping her.'" A gasp came from somewhere behind us. Marcus jerked upright. "That's private." The judge held up a hand. "Sit." I opened my notes again. Until I started reading my notes, I said quietly, "Everyone here assumed their story was the only story." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I read off dates showing when Haley told Mom I was unstable, compared to footage of me giving a department presentation that same afternoon. Calm. Composed. Nothing like the character they'd painted. I read out entries documenting every time Marcus told my parents I'd been snapping or withdrawing, paired with messages where he assured Haley, "It's working. They think she's losing it." Haley's eyes brimmed, but not with sorrow. This was panic, raw and unfiltered. Marcus turned red in the face. "Riley, stop. This is exactly what it is," I replied. I brought out the final page. Not dramatic, not explosive, simple. A timeline chart, color-coded, neat, unmistakable. This, I said, placing it gently before the judge, is the communication audit, summarizing the months of manipulation leading up to today's hearing. It shows intentional misrepresentation, coordinated storytelling, and attempts to weaponize family pressure into financial gain. Silence settled over the room like dust. Then slowly, the judge leaned back. Your petition for support, they said, turning to Haley and Marcus, is denied. Additionally, this court is troubled by the pattern of deception presented here today. You may face further review for misuse of legal procedure, Mom gasped. Dad muttered something under his breath. Haley clutched Marcus's arm. Marcus stared at the floor. Both of them looked small. And then it happened. The collapse. The unraveling, the panic that had been building behind their ribs broke open ugly and loud. They went pale. And then they screamed. Not horror movie screams, not dramatic wails, just the desperate choking sound of people who finally understood that the truth they buried had claws. And today, it dug back. I closed my folder calmly, the way you might close a chapter in a book you'd read too many times. The bailiff called for order. But there was no returning to order. Not for them, not anymore. I turned, smoothed my blazer, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I didn't need to. I already knew the story had finally irrevocably shifted. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, cooler, clearer, like Portland itself exhaled with me. I didn't rush. I didn't check whether anyone followed. The world was finally quiet. Behind me, I could still hear fragments of raised voices, my parents demanding answers, Haley sobbing, Marcus insisting it wasn't supposed to go this way. But none of it belonged to me anymore. I walked down the steps, slowly feeling each moment settle into place. Not triumph, not revenge, just release. For the first time in years, my body felt like it belonged entirely to me, my breath, my choices, my future. My phone buzzed once. A message from Mom we didn't know. I didn't reply. Some truths don't need an audience, and some betrayals don't get rewound. At the corner, I waited for the light to turn, watching leaves drift across the pavement. I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking back to myself. In the end, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally choosing myself after years of being written out of my own story. If you've ever had to rebuild after a betrayal like that, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.